taxing an activity is always difficult. Taxing a thing is easier. So the gas tax was always a proxy for taxing driving itself.
Electric vehicles are not paying into the fund as they're not paying gas tax. Welcome back. Today's guest is Jeff Davis, a senior fellow at the Eno Center for Transportation and editor of Eno Transportation Weekly. With over 30 years in federal transportation policy, he specializes in the federal budget, the Highway Trust Fund, and long-term funding trends. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
For people who don't follow transportation policy very closely, which might be many people, what exactly is the Highway Trust Fund?
Most people vaguely remember hearing in high school that one of President Eisenhower's big accomplishments was setting the interstate system on a path to getting it built, interstate highway system. Congress actually commissioned the route map of the interstates during World War II in 1944, and the 48 states negotiated the map in 1947, but it took until 1956 to figure out how to pay to build this 41,000-mile system of divided highways. And what they came up with was they increased taxes on gasoline and the trucking industry. And then the trucking interests weren't going to go along with that easily if they thought the money might get diverted to some other things. So they created this little fund modeled on the Social Security Trust Fund called the Highway Trust Fund. They said, okay, we'll put all the gasoline and diesel and trucking taxes in there, and we'll only spend that money on building highways. And you can keep track of it over the years and decades it'll take this project to come to fruition. And it worked for a while, but for some reasons I'll explain in a minute, things started to go wrong. And since 2008, the fund has been bankrupt. We've had to put in over $200 billion in bailouts of it ever since then. And that amount is going to increase significantly, probably, unless we can figure out something else to do next year when when Congress is supposed to deal with rewriting the programs.
You said in 2008, this fund is not keeping pace with the expenditures. Why is the reason? I saw that they haven't raised the gas tax since 1993. A lot of cars are a lot more efficient nowadays than they were. Right? What are the reasons, I guess?
There's three big reasons. Two of them were sort of slow motion trends that finally caught up with us in 2008. First of all, so the gasoline tax is the basis, the biggest tax of these. But really, the federal government doesn't care how many gallons of nasty smelling vicious hydrocarbon you want to collect in your closet. It was always that they're trying to tax the underlying act of driving a motor vehicle on the roads. But taxing an activity is always difficult. Taxing a thing is easier. So the gas tax was always a proxy for taxing driving itself. And there was two problems with that. The first one is that the amount of the total driving going on in the U.S. each year doesn't increase like it used to. We measured in terms of vehicle miles traveled, VMT. One vehicle going 1 mile is one VMT. And back in the 50s and 60s, the glory days of building the interstate, that total increased by about 4.5% per year, which is pretty big. That doubles every 16 years, which it did, because you had the baby boom happening, more people, more kids. You had women in the workforce needing a separate car. Cars were actually pretty cheap. Gas was cheap. The roads were opening up to go more places. There's a lot more driving going on. And then you had the 70s with first the OPEC oil shock in 73, 74. And then the Iranian Revolution took even more oil out of the system in 79, 80. And after that, the rate didn't drive as much. So people stopped increasing the rate of driving quite as much. And that increased by about 2.5% per year. And then in 2003 and 4, the price of a barrel of crude about tripled, and that took it down another notch. So since 2003, the amount of that VMT goes up each year has only been a little less than 1% per year. And they predict it's only going to be about 0.8% per year forever. It takes about a century for it to double at that rate. But the important thing was 4.5% was more than inflation. 2.5% was a little less than inflation. 1% is a lot less than inflation. So for a few decades, they didn't have to raise the tax rate in terms of cents per gallon because the underlying activity was increasing so fast. Now it's not. But it took a long time for people to really notice that because the changes happen so slowly. And the second thing is that, as you started to mention, after the OPEC thing in the 70s, Congress ordered automakers to start making their cars more efficient, increase the miles per gallon. So in terms of collecting money out of gallons, which we're still doing, you need to turn that fraction upside down and look at it in terms of gallons per mile, actually gallons per 100 miles. So back in 1960, your average passenger car, if you drove it 100 miles, it would use about 7 gallons of gasoline. And today, that's down to 4 gallons per 100 miles. But so that means that the gasoline tax is a worsening proxy for the amount of that's being driven out there. So the amount of driving doesn't increase anymore like it used to. Gas is a worse priority, worse proxy than it was. So those two things sort of snuck up. And then the third problem is more a political than demographic one, is that the political system is so broken that people are accustomed, Joe voters, you and I are accustomed to being told we can have things for free and not pay for them. And we start voting that way. We don't reward politicians who explain to us that someone somewhere has to pay for this at some time. So the last time Congress raised the gas tax for highways was in 1982. They went from 4 cents a gallon to 9 cents a gallon to make up for all that inflation you had in the 70s. And since then, it's been raised twice, but both times it was in 1990 and 1993, it was as part of these larger 5-year deficit reduction agreements, went to the general revenue, not to the Highway Trust Fund. After 5 years, got transferred in. So it was part of a larger political process. And so between those three things, it's driving doesn't increase like it used to, gasoline number of gallons sold is a worsening proxy, and no one can agree on tax revenue increases even for a significant public good anymore. That led to Congress just kicking the can down the road each time the trust fund run out of money, and they put in $272.8 billion out of the general fund so far, and they're now running deficits around $30 billion a year. So when that runs out in 2028, we'll have to deal with this again.
80% of roads, the actual funding comes from the state, and 20% comes from the federal government. And then I was you're talking about this 18.4 cents per gallon at the federal level, but then you also have a state tax. I believe California, between the state tax, they have some other surcharges, some other carbon charges. It's like 90 cents a gallon, which is significantly more than what the federal government is charging. So how does it work when you have a state and you have state highways or federal highways or bike lanes, crosswalks, they want to widen a street? How is all this factored in? Does all this turn into one fund at a state level, or federal is different than state? Like, how does that work?
They got to keep track of the federal money separately. Back in the beginning, this program started in 1916. They said, well, we got to do something. And so for 5 years, they would just give out a little bit of money to each state for 50-50 cost shared, upgrade roads, whichever roads you want to states. And that result, a state would do a mile here, a mile there, didn't connect to anything. So in 1921, they got clever. They said, okay, each state come up with a network of 7% of your miles, rural, not urban, and we'll connect those all on a national network somehow. And the federal government will help improve those. And then the rest of the roads can be just at purely state expense. So from 1921 until fairly recently, that was the concept. There was a certain network of roads that were designated to get federal money to help upgrade. And that includes all the interstates and all those big backbone old federal highways with 2-digit roads like Route 66, Route 50, and the from 1 to 101 on the going east-west. And there's the big roads like that. And then and a certain amount they would let states do smaller, the smaller roads with. And then they got into the business of federal government supporting roads in urban areas after World War II. And then the mission creep keeps expanding. So there's all kinds of different programs. There's one federal program that says it's just for letting states increase, better guardrails and line markings and, safety-oriented projects. And there's one that's just about congestion, building HOV lanes and other things to decrease congestion and increase air quality. The big one that's about half the federal money that's just interstates and the big national highway system roads and bridges, and this, that, and the other thing. But you're right, for the most part, the federal roads are a small percent of the national total, but a much larger percent of the traffic, because so much more of your interstate truck traffic is on the interstate systems, which are still a 90+% federal responsibility. The third share got increased, by the way. It used to be 50-50 back in the day. And then they went to 90-10 federal state on the interstate starting in 1956, and everything else stayed 50-50. And then as the interstates got complete in the 70s, you started to be able to see most of the interstates were complete. There was a few big, expensive urban ones that were still holding things up. The state said, well, we left that 90% bit. We should get a little more. So the federal share of everything else went from 50 to 70, 70 to 75, and now it's 80 is usually the standard for non-interstate roads. But again, it's just the roads that they designated in 1921, plus some ones have been added there to that federal aid system. The big roads.
Jeff, I saw you on a congressional hearing. You were an expert witness. And since this fund has been not solvent since 2008, I mean, you're in Congress, you were an expert witness for Congress, you live in DC. What's the consensus around DC? Like, do we need to get rid of this fund? Does it need to have some modifications? Do we need to change completely how the highways are actually funded? Like you're talking about, instead of having this one size fits all gas tax, do we need to be taxing per mile? The heavier vehicles need to be paying more? I mean, what's kind of like the overall consensus as you actually are there in the Capitol?
Even before the insolvency happened, there were signs that the trends were not supportable. Back in the 2005 transportation law, Congress implemented these two blue ribbon commissions to study, bring all the experts together to study a way forward. And they both recommended a short-term increase in the gas tax, but switching over to some kind of, instead of paying based on gallons, to continue to tax driving based on the actual miles driven somehow. Usually some kind of technology-based system. But those reports were released right around the 2008 election. President Obama didn't want to get fenced in as having it look like his idea. That caused some years of delay, and by the time they came around to it, there were always privacy issues with that kind of thing. Those have gone away a little bit since everyone is now, giving their privacy away to big tech, and the thoughts of actually, just having people put a little app on their phone to track them while they drive is actually would be more efficient. But the problem here is that in terms of just a way to raise money for Uncle Sam, it's purely efficiency oriented. We're going to miss the gas tax when it's gone, because the federal gas and diesel taxes, they're levied at the refinery or the wholesale tank farm, one or the other, where they're removed, to go heading out to the wholesaler there. And there's only about 12 or 1,300 different points of taxation in that system. And so it doesn't take a lot of IRS manpower to collect the estimated taxes paid by 1,200 taxpayers twice a month, and then audit their paper returns every 30 days and run that system. And that raises about $35 billion a year in revenue for almost no appreciable IRS manpower and money. It's a very efficient tax. But if you're going to tax driving without taxing the fuel, you're talking about either taxing the number of drivers or the number of cars, which are 230 million, 280 million, respectively, I think. And so going from 1,200 or so points of taxation to well north of 200 some million points of taxation is a administrative manpower problem for the IRS that Congress has never really publicly debated, even though some people, when I explain it to them, they get a little queasy looking because, what about people who don't, my grandparents didn't file taxes the last few years of their lives. They still drove. They didn't make enough money to actually, so is the IRS going to be establishing direct relationships with people who don't have enough money to file income tax but still drive, just to collect $50, $80, $100 a year in mileage taxes or whatever it would be? I don't see that happening. There are too many potential problems there. The Congress has done this once before. During World War II, they had to really restrict driving, not so much because we didn't have enough gasoline, because we did, but because of a fungus that was growing in Latin America starting in the 1930s. Every rubber tree in Latin America died in the 1930s. So by World War II, all the rubber was in Asia or Africa. And you needed rubber to build tires, particularly high pressure airplane tires, and also do all the gaskets and hoses and belts that engines need. And we had to save tires somehow. And the only way to save tires, they determined, was to ration gasoline and discourage people from driving. So as part of a way to raise money off that, the federal government taxed the driving at $5 a year. You would purchase, I got the stuff from eBay, a little stamp here and put it in your windshield of your car, and to prove that you had paid your $5 a year federal driving tax. And the problem was that then they were able to do that because there happened to be a federal government facility in every town in America that already sold stamps called the post office. That was back when the post office was a department of government. So the IRS was able to stick the post office with the manpower of actually selling stamps and collecting the money. But even then, people mostly went along for the first couple of years out of patriotism, and then they realized that there was no enforcement. Once in a while, an IRS agent would show up in a town, deputize some deputies, issue 40 or 50 tickets. They would go to the federal courthouse and they pay $5. And then so by the end of the war, the cooperation with that particular tax had significantly declined. And so I wonder about the opportunities for fraud and just refusal to go along with any kind of mileage tax that gets rolled out if we decide to go that way.
You think there'll be any modifications to this highway trust fund anytime soon? If you're saying that it's been insolvent since 2008 and they've just been pulling money out of the general fund, so they've basically been able to make it work for the last almost 2 decades, is there any reason for them to change? Like, what are the benefits of them actually making these modifications? I mean, even like, I believe in your testimony, you basically say it's more due to accounting than anything. Like, they still have the money to fund it. So I guess the question is, how important is it to actually make this either solvent or to modify it?
In terms of honesty, it's not fair that some parts of government get to just live outside the rules and everyone else has to buckle down and take percentage cuts or get sequestered or have to live behind budget ceilings and not. So there's a fairness argument that that now that the highway program is not self-funding anymore, they shouldn't continue to enjoy some of those privileges that they used to have. But also, it's bad policy that there should be some kind of restriction on the growth rate they get to connect it some way to at least because it grew faster than inflation last time. But also, here's the thing: there are a bunch of different parts of the government that are now funded by these self-funded trust funds. The highway one was the first one to really run out of money like this and get continuously bailed out. Congress has come to accept that idea. It's been but $200 billion over 16, 17 years. It's a lot of money, but in terms of the overall economy, it's not enough to notice. So we're printing money just for highways, but that's not enough money to really set the economy off. The problem is that we're going to get to the point in another 2 or 3 years where the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Fund run out of money. And because Congress has had this experience with the Highway Trust Fund running money, we'll just print money and put it in there. On the scale the Highway Trust Fund works, you can get away with that without triggering things like inflation and the international bond market noticing. But the Social Security and Medicare trust funds are so much higher that people will notice very quickly and take steps accordingly. And so because of that, I worry that once they do whatever they wind up doing, painful as it may be, to set the Social Security and Medicare trust funds aright, that there was, no more free ride for highways either. So that's coming in a couple of more years, even if they bail out the Highway Trust Fund one more time, and it's scheduled to run out in late 2027, early 2028, right now at the current pace. It should have been already, but when they put the last bailout in, they assumed 0% interest. The $118 billion went in there in late 2011, and then interest rates went up to where it was earning 4.5% on what was left of the bailout. So that has extended the solvency date by another year or two.
As I mentioned, I saw you at this congressional hearing giving your expert testimony. It seemed like one of the big reasons you're there is nowadays, obviously, the EVs or the electric vehicles are a lot more prominent, and electric vehicles are not paying into the fund as they're not paying, gas tax. But at the same time, EVs are like 2% of all vehicles on the road. So it's a small percentage, and the fund is already losing a bunch of money anyways. But as we go forward into the future, as we have more electric vehicles, it seems like you would have to have a switch. I mean, didn't Biden, or I believe when he was president, say that by like 2030, they want 50% of cars on the road to be EVs, which is obviously not going to happen. But if you did theoretically even have 25% of cars on the road that were EVs, it'd be a massive hit, even more so to that fund. How do the EVs play into this equation?
You're correct. In general terms, you're correct. I told the Senate Budget Committee, I think, that EVs didn't cause the highway trust funds problem, but the rate at which EVs get adopted into the fleets determines how much worse it gets and when. But we'll know more in another 2 months, because each year the Congressional Budget Office updates its forecast for a lot of things, and they do a pretty good with the Highway Trust Fund. And the last one they did was January of 2025, and because it had happened right after President Biden's EPA had put in these rules about increasing the mileage to the point where it didn't say it was a EV mandate, but practically it was going to work like that. There was no practical way for a lot of automakers to meet those targets without putting a lot of more EVs in the streets. And also we had the $7,500 per EV credit. And so those were already fully signed into law and were fully reflected in their forecast. And that forecast had gasoline tax receipts going down very quickly, starting in 5 years from now, whoosh. And because since then, we've repealed the $7,500 EV tax credit, and they've repealed all those regulations that the EPA and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration had that were forcing a EV switch over faster than the market might have gone along with it. I suspect that the next baseline forecast has to reflect those new laws and new rules, and so it won't be quite as quick. But but you are correct. They don't pay anything into the trust fund at the moment. And if you're going to continue to have a user pay, user benefit principle paying for this thing, they should pay something. You can get into an argument on what level they should pay, but the fact they should pay something if we're going to continue this user pay, user benefit trust fund thing is pretty well established.
There's a difference between federal and state, but for instance, there's 4 states that actually have instituted a financial mechanism for EVs. Utah's one of them. And there's a lot of states that are certainly collecting some type of revenue for these EVs and do you think that some of the state level stuff could be implemented at more of a federal level, as some of these states are clearly being able to fund their programs at 100% rate?
Yeah, there are 4 or 5 states have actually tried to do more of a broader VMT measurement. Oregon started the way. Hawaii's got something. Virginia, New Jersey have sort of on a voluntary basis where you can stop paying gasoline tax and pay a mileage fee instead, and get your gas tax rebated back to you. And they also have provisions for electric vehicles to pay the mileage fee as well. And a bunch of other states, it's easier. It's pretty easy to make people write a larger check once a year when they register their car. You get their tags, and so they've got some kind of deal on some kind of adjustment where if you're registering an EV, you have to pay a higher fee. And some states try to estimate it for what the average mileage would be per year for a car. Some states that do odometer readings each year with the safety inspection are able to actually compare. But I'm from Tennessee. We didn't have any state, still don't have any state inspection. So no one from the government checks the odometer of your car between the time you buy it and the time you sell it. So you have to use those kind of states. Would have to be some kind of estimate of how much a person would drive that car in a year, and maybe it's right and maybe it's not. If I had an EV, I wouldn't do long distance trips with it. I would just do all my around town stuff, and then have a separate car to go long distance. And so it would be a low mileage for me, but other people might do it differently. Texas, I believe, was trying to get possibly a little more revenue out of the electric vehicle owners than I would think would easily be justifiable. But to each their own. But they're out there. The problem is the federal government has never really done a registration fee before. They're thinking about it now. It's one of the options under consideration when Congress is looking to rewrite these programs starting early next year. But the paperwork problems there are kind of intense. You get to they buy the list from states. Would it be more efficient to do that? Will they just try to pay the states to collect a federal registration fee on top of the existing state registration fee? What tiers do you do it? Do you have it weight based? That really makes a lot of difference if you're trying to be accurate, particularly for trucks, heavier trucks. The weight really makes so much of the difference in the actual wear and tear that the vehicle puts on the roads. Electric vehicles tend to be heavier than their corresponding internal combustion vehicles. It's because of the batteries. And that's been a particular problem with attempts to do battery-operated heavy trucks like tractor trailers, because there's already an 80,000-pound weight limit on those on the interstates. And if you add an extra 5,000 pounds for batteries, that's got to come out of potentially the cargo capacity. So there are other issues going on there as well.
It looks like somewhere around 20% is non-road maintenance, where you have big city mass transit systems, and I believe it's cities over 50,000, fixing old rail systems, buying buses, bus garages. You also have bike lanes, walking paths. How are those people paying into the system? Are those users paying into the system? And does something like that need to be changed at all? If it doesn't seem like that's a 20% deficit, that's not necessarily paying for their usage at all, or maybe I'm reading that wrong.
You're correct. After the interstate law was passed in 56, when the fine print came out of where the roads were going to go, specifically through major cities instead of around a bunch of major cities, some cities really pushed back. San Francisco led the Great Freeway Revolt. Washington, D.C., and several others really didn't like the degree to which some neighborhoods were going to be divided by these interstate freeways and the change would have on urban living. And they were pushing back and said, we don't need more interstates through the city. We need better mass transit. That's what the city guys were saying. And the highway guys were saying in Congress, well, that's fine, but this is a user pay, user benefit trust fund, and you don't, and transit don't pay, so transit shouldn't get the money. And they were arguing past each other for about 10 years there, because one was having a process-based argument, the other was having a facts on the ends on the ground argument. But finally, in 1972, the urban interests were able to defeat the highway bill, and they weren't able to reauthorize it. So they came back in 73 and said, okay, we'll start to let cities and states use some of their highway formula money for transit if they want to. And then in 82, in order to get a lot of Democratic urban votes in favor of the gas tax increase, the big gas tax increase, President Reagan agreed to establish a mass transit account that got 20% of the tax increase. They raised the tax by a nickel a gallon, so 1% of that went to the new gas. The penny for transit went to the new mass transit account within the trust fund, and the next two increases they had after that in 1990 and 93 also put 20% of the increase into the mass transit account. So today that gets 2.8 cents of the gasoline and diesel fuel taxes. But the rest of the gas and diesel taxes and the 3 trucking taxes, I should mention, are still all in the highway account. So that's been the problem, is that transit gets 20% of new taxes, but that's not 20% of all taxes. And some people think they're entitled to 20% of the spending, and that's their imbalance on dollars in versus dollars out of the transit account is much worse proportionately than the highway account.
This is basically a stat that I read. You can tell me if it's true or not, but it was that the federal government funds 90% of interstate construction costs, but then states and local municipalities have to handle the maintenance, which will create these massive unfunded backlogs, as every new mile costs an estimated $24,000 per year just to maintain. And so basically you'll have the federal government come in, be like, hey, we're going to put this here, pay for it, but then the municipality, the state is responsible for maintaining it, and that maintenance cost over the life of that road is significantly more than the original cost. And then secondly, that they have these massive federal regulations that maybe for a state that's, maybe they just have some little row that they want to put in. Maybe you don't need to have, I guess you could say, all this extra hoops you have to jump through, where you have to get the EPA and all these things for some little, I don't know, maybe a widening of something or narrow or whatever. You know what I'm saying? I guess is that true? I mean, that was what I was hearing.
That is true to an extent. The original act of 1956 said, okay, Uncle Sam will pay 90% of interstate construction. Fabulous amount of money. Had no provision in there for what to do with them once they got constructed. But by the time the system was almost completely built in the 80s, they were starting to need to update some of those assets. And so now there is it started off as the Interstate 4R, I think, revivalence, repavement, it became interstate maintenance. And now it is an eligible function. States can spend some of their relatively scarce federal dollars on maintaining those interstates. But it is an expensive proposition, and states have a lot of needs. And you're also true that every federal dollar comes with a bevy of regulatory conditions that go along with it. Because Congress figured out a long time ago that even in situations where the Constitution does not give Congress the ability to regulate things directly, they don't have police power over general construction stuff, but they can attach as many conditions as they want to money, and they can print money. So as long as as the conditions are not too onerous, people will usually take the money. But some states are now finding a way around that, depending on how dependent they are on Uncle Sam. For example, Utah and I think Florida, they organize their federal money where they only use their federal dollars now for repaving and resurfacing and fixing existing roads and bridges, because there's no new environmental clearances for the most part you need for that. And the federal paperwork is very small. And when they've got a new feature to build, a new road or a new bridge or a new transit system, they will try to use all of their just their own state tax money, and therefore only have to deal with their own paperwork.
How do you see self-driving cars influencing the, I guess, federal policy in the trust fund? I mean, or maybe we're not there yet, but I would imagine some of these new technologies that if self-driving cars eventually are a little bit more ubiquitous. I mean, there is a little bit what is in like San Francisco and a couple other cities, but how would that impact everything if that were to be a little bit more ubiquitous?
That's a really good question. When I first joined the Eno Center 10.5 years ago, one of our first was we'd gotten a grant from somebody. We had a really big conference in downtown DC about, AVs, or, self-driving cars. What's the future going to be? And we had all these different academics come from several universities and the automakers, and we had a guy from Intel who ran their program. They were all there. And there was no consensus on basic things like, do you think that the trend towards self-driving cars will result in more vehicles going more distances, or fewer vehicles going shorter distances? And they couldn't even agree on that. Because on the one hand, the guy from Intel had told me, he's like, my mom calls me, every couple months, and where's my self-driving car? I want to get out more. So the fact that self-driving cars could encourage people to be using motor vehicles that currently aren't, and they're staying home, versus a lot of this is based on assuming, are you going to finally get around the ownership model of most private cars, or you buy into these pools to take an EV when you want one, or just rely on whoever owns Waymo is going all in on the EV taxi. To the extent, I presume that most of these ones that are using the taxi model are electric, because how much more idling do you want these empty vehicles running around doing? But the safety issues of autonomous vehicles are going to have to finish being addressed and shaken through a long time before we get to anything dispositive with the effect they have on the finances. Because the AVs are still around the corner, like I've been hearing for 10 years ago, because as it turns out, the human mind is still an amazing computing machine when it comes to seeing something like a paper bag blown out of the corner of your vision and being able to instinctively know that that's not a toddler. It's a plastic bag jumping around instead of a toddler jumping around. And just little cues like that. It's taken a long time to get there. Waymo has come up with enough data now in these carefully mapped downtown city areas where they operate with these taxis that the safety record's coming around, but it's going to be a long time before AVs are out there to the extent they're really going to affect the financing side of things. Right now, just everyone needs to pay attention to the safety aspects and to make sure that, because every time a AV hits someone, it makes national news. Every time an idiot human, does the same exact thing, it causes the same kind of accident, it tends not to be national news. So we have to see better data on how often these incidents with AVs are actually occurring versus the stuff you see just excerpted in the internet and whatnot.
How much of that is just passing blame onto someone, though? Like, if a human kills someone, then clearly that person's at fault and their insurance pays for it. Maybe that person goes to jail. If an AI made a mistake and killed someone, who are you going after? And are you putting that AI machine in jail? Are you like, okay, this Tesla is going into a cage for 2 years, and the legal side of things is a completely different issue from the practicality and the technology side of things.
And it's a sort of unexplored area, because traditionally, at least since the 1960s in LBJ, the regulating the safety of the automobile, the product that comes out of the factory and that you go buy, that's the federal government. And the safety of the drivers themselves, making sure they actually know how to drive competently and don't do illegal things and don't be unsafe, that's on the state. So car is federal, driver is state. And the point at which the vehicle becomes the driver then flips the script. And we still, the legal situation is still about the driver being the human individual in there. So you have to, we still haven't found a good way. Congress was on path to do this about 6-7 years ago and pass a law in the Senate, pass both in the Senate, hopefully the House, setting some new rules like this. But part of the deal is that, as you can imagine, lawyers and their willingness to and ability to sue people, whether on behalf of an insurance company or against an insurance company, to settle all this, is a big consideration. And the law on those varies considerably from state to state. Part of the deal with federal preemption of the safety standards was going to be federally preempting, or at least trying to regulate or come to a system of consolidation of all the different state rules. And the lawyers who make their living filing civil lawsuits at state level didn't go along with that. And so that torpedoed the Senate bill a few years ago, and both sides have really dug in ever since then. So having the federal government try to take over and write new rules, making the driver of the car and changing the sort of burden there has run into the problem of the established legal system wanting to work it all out in state courts.
We've all heard in school how Eisenhower went over to Germany, saw the Autobahn, and then he came over to the U.S. That was the inspiration for the federal highway system. So if we're looking in 2025, almost 2026 to Europe or other countries for inspiration, what international model of transit funding or governance do you find to be the best solution to this deficit that we have in the highway trust fund right now?
First, Eisenhower was a young captain in 1919. He was put along as an observer on the first cross-country Army truck convoy in the U.S. from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco over mostly unimproved dirt roads. And after about a month of misery he later wrote about. So his experience with the German roads decades later came after that hell swamp that he'd gone through here. That certainly made him realize the effect that would have both on the economy and on defense, evacuation of cities, things like that, the ability to move people around if you get invaded. That's was also a big point for him. But in terms of how they go about it, it's hard to compare most countries to the U.S. because most of our peer nations don't have reserved sovereignty at the state or province level. It's all like traditionally in England, the king took all the money and then gave it all back, and there was no one in between the citizen and the king was really entitled to be some kind of other entity of tax collection and government. But Switzerland, and to a lesser extent, Germany and Australia and Canada sort of are like our the local provinces or states have some power. Germany has done something where they've gone entirely to pay for the Autobahn system just by itself as the only real national focus, and they're paying that entirely with truck tolls, electronic truck tolls, because they had to move beyond the fuel taxes because they were sick and tired of people gassing up their truck in Poland and driving straight through to the other side of France, or something, and get left out of it at all. Similarly, Japan, when they finished building their national interstate system, lowered their fees and got rid of their trust fund and started funding things based on tolls. The problem is that in America, there's a large regional bias towards tolls, and I've never really understood why. That if you the certain old school, in New Jersey, the Pennsylvania Turnpike, Indiana Turnpike were adopted into the interstate system in 1956, and Florida had been able to get away with toll roads down there, but the rest of the South and other parts of the country, that just the voters just seem dead set against it. So that's another problem you get, because that's in theory the best way to ensure local control for and demand. I get tired of people talking about I call it Neil Armstrong syndrome. We can put a man on the moon, we can do this, X, Y, and Z. And so in California, they would say, "Oh, we can build the Golden Gate Bridge. Why can't we do X, Y, and Z?" I said, "Well, remember, the Golden Gate Bridge was built entirely at the expense of the local citizens of the Bay Area. Not a single dime of federal or state money went into that. That was just they wanted to build a bridge, and they floated the bonds on their own, and they built it, and they charged the tolls necessary to collect and pay off those bonds. They were in a position they could do that. But I suspect that we're going to have some kind of regularized general fund support of the system because it's gotten too much out of hand that you'd have to more than double the tax burden on highway users were you to make it solvent and anywhere close to today's spending rates. And so if we're going to have some kind of general fund contribution, I would much rather not have it be this haphazard, okay, well, we need $40 million to get through the next 2.5 years. Let's just, print money and do it, and have it actually done in the regular budget process. Okay, well, here's how we'll do this. We'll do money, say an extra $10 billion per year in addition to what the highway users are paying through their revenues, and here's how we'll spend it, and get it all planned ahead of time rather than just bail out the system after the money's broke. Because the thing to remember about this program, both the federal highway program and the federal transit program, and most other those transportation grants they give out, they are reimbursable by the state partner. So state gets permission to start a project, and state goes out and builds the project, pays its own money, hires a contractor, does all the work, and then at the end of a interval, they ask the federal government to pay them back and reimburse them for 80, 90, whatever the ratio is for that project. And usually the same day or next day electronic reimbursements. But you can't just stop. If you stop those, states notice pretty quickly, and depending on how well the state manages its cash, it can be a quick problem. But as a result, by the time the federal trust fund hits the wall, it's too late to just cut spending, because the states are already spending their own money and actually awaiting the federal government to pay them what they are owed. And if they can go to claims court and get it, it would take some time, but that's part of the urgency, that because those are reimbursable programs, the stakeholders in the states always have kind of a gun to Congress's head the minute the money starts to run out. And so we don't think these programs through on the spending side or the revenue match side beforehand. We just have to worry about it at the end, once the work is done and money's already owed to people.
Do you think in, say, like 2030, 2035, and kind of the foreseeable future, we'll have kind of like, I wouldn't say like a digital ID, but maybe your car will have a digital ID where we all will have our vehicles tracked by miles, and you'll end up essentially paying per mile as a way to solve this solution? It seemed like in that congressional hearing, that was kind of a topic that was brought up quite a bit. And then if that was the case, I guess, how is this monitored? If you're on like a road trip, from California to New York City, like every state you pass through, maybe you're paying surcharges because you're a tourist, or maybe if you're on a federal road, you're paying X, and then you're on a state highway paying Y. Maybe you're driving through peak hours and the rate changes. After listening to that hearing, I would say that I didn't feel too confident that the system we have now is going to be around, and 10 years from now, we're going to probably either have a smartphone or some tracker in everyone's vehicle. You were there. What did you think?
GPS-based VMT tracking. From an economic perspective, it's perfect because you could allocate every mile you drive. You can know whether it's on a federal road, a state road, a local road, multiply it times the weight of your car, and we get the most perfectly fair economic outcome from that. It's also the biggest privacy nightmare and a real problem to collect, just because, I'm not at all certain that the federal government has the legal authority to order states to go along with that or to do it themselves. And if they don't, there's always some New Hampshire live free or die state that might, that just refuses to go along with it. And so I question how, unless all 50 states decided to run their own programs that worked identically with the same technology and the same bookkeeping back end at the same time, the federal government piggybacked on that. I don't see how much you could get any kind of, it would just be so difficult. And particularly because the dollar amounts we're talking about are not that great. The average, I believe, would be, let's see, what was it last year? $130, something like that in total highway trust fund user fees. In 2024 per capita is the average. So a lot of people will be paying more, a lot of people paying less. There's a limit to how much you're going to want to have the government set up and go after people and track them down to get that kind of money a year. How many hours is the government employee making, $70,000 a year going to spend, trying to tax Jane Smith and get the because she drove enough mileage to owe $70 last year, and then I think it's probably you're going to be better off with some kind of national registration fee or some kind of fee that piggybacks onto the state registration fees, just because you can pitch it as you're not taxing the act of driving, you're taxing access to the act of driving, the next best thing. And while it's not nearly as perfect from an economic point of view, the savings you would have in implementation and the benefits you'd have in privacy would probably outweigh the economic imperfections of it. But even then, you've got to get it started now. The phase-in for anything like this would be multi-year, and they would really have to start the education process now to get anything like that implemented in the next 5 years.
You're saying that at the federal level, they've been running this deficit since 2008, yet the highway tax on petrol is 18.4 cents a gallon, on diesel is 24 cents a gallon. How much would that have to be for it not to be in debt, for it to actually either be breaking even or generating a profit in 2025? You talking 40, 50, 60 cents a gallon?
You'd have to pretty much double gasoline. And the amount diesel is kind of fungible with, there's three trucking taxes: a tax on the heavy truck tires, there's a tax on super heavy trucks once a year, a sticker tax, and then there's 12% on the cost of a new truck over 10,000 pounds or trailer, highway rated trailer. And those other three bring in about $7 billion a year, and then diesel brings in about $9.5 billion. And so those are pretty much just those are the trucking industry together. You can because the truck industry now wants to get rid of the truck tax, and all their arguments against the subsidy tax are very good. They say that that because the price of trucks has been going up, it's not fair, and they're saying that it's inhibiting people from buying the latest technology. And if you want them to move to cleaner emission trucks, taxing the expense is not the way to do it. They're all good arguments against that tax, except that would dig the hole $6 or $7 billion a year deeper, and they don't have a particularly good plan for replacing that. The big fleets would rather have an increase in taxes than the owner-operators, because the owner-operators traditionally only one guy owns his own truck, and usually a used one that he bought after a fleet sold theirs. So there's a differences between the agendas of the individual owner-operator truck drivers versus the big corporate fleets. So you have to figure. We haven't figured out yet. Basically, my bottom line is how much of the total share the trucking industry should pay for versus the regular passenger car and SUV/pickup truck drivers. We got to get that worked through as well.
You're the editor of the Eno Transportation Weekly. What's a story that's underreported or going on right now that most people don't know about?
One thing that has been noticed a lot lately that people noticed during inflation, but has been building up to that, the price of new motor vehicles has gotten out of hand for a variety of reasons. Overall economic inflation, so the supply chain problems, the microchip issue we had in Taiwan a couple of years ago. And then also, but President Trump has now tried to make it make cars more affordable again as part of the agenda. And I don't know about you, but I've got a Mazda CX-5 that I drive. It's got the automatic rear view camera. Those are now things like that are mandatory in new cars, pretty much. And I love it. I am so much better at parking now, and it's so much, if there are kids in my neighborhood, not less likely to back over them. And there are a whole host of other kind of safety devices, some of which Congress has considered mandating in the future. So we need to think more about, make sure we think of, they do make the car cost more. There's no way around that. How much is being a little bit safer worth to us? There are areas where it may not make sense. We installed that. There was a terrible crash, 2009, maybe 2008, in Chatsworth, California. A Metrolink train hit a freight. It was hit by a freight train. Huge loss of life. And because of that, the Congress took up a proposal that had been on the shelf for years, requiring trains to install electronic signaling to ping each other and tell you where they are, called positive train control, and hit the automatic brakes when another train was getting too close. And they installed it. It cost tens of billions of dollars for the freight railroads to do it. And Congress had to step in and wind up giving the cities that had their local commuter trains, cities and states, money to install them because they were going to be on the same tracks. But it had never been done because it never was going to pass cost-benefit analysis, because there's a bureaucrat of the Office of Management and Budget right now today who's in charge of what's called VSL, Value of a Statistical Life. And that's the dollar amount the government is required to put in the safety regulations. It says if the cost to industry is X and the number of lives saved times that value is that doesn't get up there, you don't do the rule. And this whole endeavor was never going to pass cost-benefit analysis and based on VSL, but Congress wound up doing it anyway because it was a big headline. And a lot of what's happening, both with the autonomous vehicles, like you mentioned, the issue with the heated bearings in that train accident we had in East Palestine, Ohio, a couple of years ago. They're still working through that. And one of the solutions would be to mandate 2 people in the cab instead of 1. How much that would cost. I think where a lot of people don't think of the trade-offs necessary for safety rules, and how much more is it going to be worth? How much more are we all willing to feel a little bit safer? And is that amount justified? Is one of the bigger trends I think that's going to be coming up again here in the future pretty soon.
So last big question before we wrap this podcast up, which is just, since you've been analyzing transit and transit policy for over 3 decades, what's the biggest myth that people think in their mind about, whether it's the highway, whether it's roads, whether it's trains, airplanes? You talk about the FAA in some of your articles. And what's the biggest transit myth that we have? I
still get people insisting that the height of interstate overpasses was set so they could carry nuclear missiles, or something like that. That's not true. A bunch of good myths about Eisenhower, although I spent a week at the Eisenhower Library and found out that all these notes that his secretary, Ann Whitman, would give him mostly about what the weather was going to be like at Augusta National Golf Course that weekend. So yeah, the bit about Ike being obsessed with golf was true. That part was true. There's one I had to correct. Right, you mentioned that the diesel tax for the Highway Trust Fund is 18.3 cents a gallon. The 18.4, there's 1/10 of a cent that goes to the EPA for what's called, my favorite acronym, LUST, leaking underground storage tanks. So 1/10 of a cent per gallon goes to LUST to clean up abandoned service stations. Another 18.3 goes to the highways. Same, and it would mess with diesel. It's 24.4 cents total, 24.3 of which goes to highways. And people just assume that the difference is because of that there were more, because of something about diesel vehicles do more damage, something like that. Not at all. In 82, they actually passed a law that had a brand new study from the Treasury Department about cost allocation and which cars and which types of vehicle did more damage per mile than less. And they wrote a whole tax system in Congress that matched up with that and then allocated everything fairly. And part of it was they said, okay, the super heavy trucks over 80,000 miles do a disproportionate share of wear and tear. We're going to tax them a lot more with this heavy vehicle sticker tax. And the problem was they had to be paid once a year. And the owner-operators didn't like it to the point they had protests. There was a riot. A guy died. And they were so against it that Congress went in a year and a half later and changed the law. That, okay, we'll cap that sticker at $550 a year, so you don't have to break the bank on it. That's going to cost us $600 million. So we're going to increase, the diesel tax by 6 cents to make up for that money. And so they did that. It was to clear, just truckers wanted to break on one tax, so they had to pay higher on another tax. It was just a simple math there. It had no other major meaning to it or not.
Do you think there's one state that has the ideal taxation system? Like I lived in Colorado for years, and I remember I bought a new vehicle and my vehicle registration was like $800, and I was coming from Wisconsin where I was paying $35 a year, and I was like, what's going on? And I talked to people and they're like, oh yeah, in Colorado your vehicle registration is based on the value of your car. So if you have a brand new car or a high-end car, you just end up paying more. And so I knew a lot of people that lived in Colorado that were from Texas or whatever, and they'd always register their vehicle in Texas because it was cheaper. I guess there's kind of loopholes, but is there a state that you think just does it better and that might be the model in the future?
There's no best. I mean, other states I know that Georgia and Florida have really high auto registration fees, particularly the first time you move in from out of state. And others do it completely differently. The laboratories of democracy, I think. And you mentioned that you get the gas. We've got gasoline taxes ranging from close to 75 cents, I think, in California, down to 8 in Alaska, and not much more than that in Oklahoma. There's no one right way to do it. I'm originally from Tennessee, which doesn't have income tax. We're one of the last 6 states that doesn't have any significant income tax. But the sales taxes, in a major city, would also have its own sales tax. The sales tax is around 10%. So, you're paying for them somewhere. Just before Amazon started collecting tax on stuff online for sales tax for states, that was a major delay. In fact, one of the things, it's a surprise that one of the things that happened that made the COVID experience not quite so bad for the federal government was that right before COVID, Supreme Court decided that case that allowed states to tax Amazon's orders from Amazon and places like that, and interstate commerce generating from that state. It's to imagine how much worse all of the financial situation in the states would have been if COVID had come around and that hadn't happened, because the states wouldn't have been able to, because everyone started ordering stuff from home, and states were able to tax that because of a random Supreme Court decision the year before. If that hadn't happened, I imagine how much they would. Anyway, that's the kind of thing I think of. There's always something going on, interesting, and there's no one state has a monopoly on wisdom.
Today's guest has been Jeff Davis, Senior Fellow at the Eno Center for Transportation, editor of the Eno Transportation Weekly. Just let us know where people can find you, get a hold of your works, and then leave us with a final thought.
Thank you for plugging the group. The Eno Center for Transportation is enotrans.org. And I will close with this. Mr. William Phelps Eno, who our founder, was a little rich kid. His father was Amos Eno, who was the first luxury hotel developer in New York City. Built the old Fifth Avenue Hotel, was the capital of Gilded Age America. But little William was stuck in a horse and buggy traffic jam in the 1860s for about 7 or 8 hours in New York City, downtown, and was finding it so fascinating that he developed the rest of his life coming up with traffic solutions. He wrote the first written rules for traffic in the U.S. for the NYPD in the 1890s. Did things like designing traffic circles, cutting up the hard left turn, things like that, in the name of greater efficiency, and then left a bunch of money to start a foundation to carry on his work. But he himself never learned to drive a car. So you can participate in the surface transportation in all kinds of ways.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.